Hello and welcome back to part 2 of my series of lore videos on Lor'themar Theron. So, as we covered in the previous episode, Lor'themar is pretty much now at the start of the Burning Crusade. He leads the Blood Elves in Kael'thas, and then Kael'thas leads them in Outland. And this was fine, but Lor'themar realised that really they had no allies. They'd kind of burned everybody in some sort of way by isolating themselves, and because of this, he thus started trying to rectify the problem. Initially, the Alliance did send an ambassador to him called Prospector Anvilward, and while things were initially going kind of well, they ended up finding a force of Night Elf Sentinels, and once they were able to draw a line between the two, they quickly realised that these Blood Elves, or Night Elves even, were trying to sabotage their arcane sanctums, and that Anvilward was actually a spy. Everyone involved was executed, which is sort of the norm. Anyway, so later on, the next attempt at an alliance happened. The Forsaken under the command of Sylvanas reached out to the Blood Elves, and Lor'themar was initially very skeptical and he played his cards close to his chest, which I suppose is fair enough given the fact that they're still the undead, they're a little bit sketchy. He did, however, allow the Forsaken to aid them in the Ghostlands, in the main attempt there to just drive off the Scourge, and I think this was more a test of whether Sylvanas was really being truthful. There was, however, no trickery, and the Forsaken helped the Farstriders in the battle, and the undead were eventually, pretty much, mostly driven back from the Ghostlands. Through this little alliance with Sylvanas, Lor'themar was then able to start working on a full alliance with the Horde. He just wanted to be a full member, essentially, and before they were fully inducted into the Horde, they would have to deal with an old friend, Dar'Khan. He ends up appearing again. As it turned out, he wasn't completely dead, and he was in fact a lich. He was leading the undead forces against the Blood Elves in the Ghostlands from his base in Deathholm. This victory, of course they did kill him, and that victory proved the strength of the new Blood Elf civilization. Feeling rather confident, Lor'themar sent a letter asking Thrall for an equal membership seat in the Horde, and that in combination with the excellent reference from Sylvanas, and also the fact that through Kael'thas, Lor'themar had some information regarding an uncorrupted clan of Mag'har orcs. So because of all these things, Thrall ended up accepting them into the Horde. Of course, for Thrall, finding an uncorrupted clan of orcs was really a major thing because, well, the Mag'har were quite the anomaly, and Thrall, of course, being from this long lineage and also being the leader of the orcs, he definitely wanted to find them, so that was definitely a very large swing on his opinion. Anyway, so later on, in the main events of the Burning Crusade, it was revealed that Kael had in fact switched allegiances, and he was now serving the Burning Legion. He led a fell elf attack on Silvermoon, in which he stole Maru, who was the Naru that they had been getting some of their energy from, especially for the Blood Knights. Anyway, so they proceeded onwards to the Isle of Kael'thas, where they set up defences, and then they started the process of summoning in Kael'thas' new master, Kil'jaeden. They were, of course, eventually defeated by players, and the Sunwell was then revitalised. Avina, who's actually a character that we covered in the last episode, does play a part here. Basically, in the fight against Kil'jaeden, she kind of sacrificed herself and is the reason why the Sunwell was revitalised. But anyway, with the last of the Sunstrider line dead, and all the traitorous elements of the Blood Elves essentially purged, Lor'themar was now the leader of their people. And despite being able to, he decided that King Ansternian was in fact the last king, and he doesn't really have enough of a reason to crown himself. He then basically decided, I'm going to be the regent, and I suppose that's really just nearly accepting the fact that it's really a new era for their people, and this whole king system is now a dead line. I suppose a little bit like Denethor in Lord of the Rings, but maybe Lor'themar's not as much of a dick. Anyway, so later on, he received a whole lot of letters. Who are these from? They're from a guy called Aethys Sunreaver. Now, you probably know who that guy is. He is in Dalaran, and he's the leader of the Sunreavers, who are a faction of Blood Elves in Dalaran. And eventually Aethys decided to visit in person, and after a run-in with Haldron, who really was trying to get him to dress fancy for Lor'themar, he ended up just speaking to Lor'themar. Lor'themar was saying, look, come on, stop with the pawns, Haldron, it's fine, I'm not really this big magnificent king as you really want me to be. Anyway, so Aethys told him that the leader of the Blue Dragonflight, Malygos, had decided to wage war upon all magic users and that they needed his help in battling him. This, of course, was rather pertinent to the Blood Elves because they were significant users of magic, Basically, the reason why Malygos started this war, which would become known as the Nexus War, is because he was really worried that all these magic users and the rampant use of magic would once again attract the attention of the Burning Legion, so he basically outlawed magic, unless it was, say, by a blue dragon. Anyway, Kael'thas represented Dalaran and, therefore, was not immediately treated like an ally. Kael'thas and his soldiers had, after all, been imprisoned in the dungeons of Dalaran, so there was a little bit of tension there. Nonetheless, though, Lor'themar did decide to grant Kael'thas hospitality, and that was fine. Kael'thas chilled out, and while he was just enjoying his hospitality, Lor'themar ended up travelling to a place called Cael'thian Lodge in the Plaguelands. Now, this place was actually a Forest Rider lodge, and the High Elves who inhabit it are ones that Lor'themar personally exiled. They were very, very bitter to him, and after a series of arguments and an attempt to mend that bridge, Lor'themar and his Forest Riders were basically forced to leave the place. If you go there now, though, everyone, or at least all of those old High Elves, they're actually all mana-starved and they're hostile to players, so that's a bit of an interesting tidbit. Anyway, when he returned from this visit, Kael'thas asked Lor'themar if he was able to find some common ground with Varisa Windrunner. Now, Varisa was opposed to Blood Elves being allowed to step foot in Dalaran, which could present a little bit of a problem. Given how their previous attempt at Cael'thian Lodge had went, they deemed it unlikely, and they decided that trying to confer with Varisa was just a lost cause. She's a High Elf. The High Elves are really not in the best kind of terms with the Blood Elves, so what's the point? Anyway, so while Lor'themar was pondering about how he could possibly deal with Kael'thas' request, he was interrupted by a messenger, and this messenger was from Sylvanas. He tried to put it off, but basically the messenger said it was very important, and that Sylvanas would not be kept waiting. As we probably know from the way Sylvanas is in-game, yeah, you don't really want to keep her waiting. Anyway, so they eventually ended up meeting atop Sunfury Spire, and Sylvanas informed him that the Horde has decided to wage war against the Lich King, and that he is required to send troops. Initially, Lor'themar didn't really want to, though. They had just overcome a civil war, and all the stuff that Kael'thas brought, and then, of course, the only recently ended fight with Scourge. But Sylvanas was not having it, and said that if he didn't send troops, then she would withdraw her support in the Ghostlands. The war with Arthas was very, very personal to Sylvanas, so she probably wouldn't really tolerate anything subverting its chances of success. Lor'themar did then agree to help Kael'thas, because Dalaran was moving up into Northrend. The fight against the Lich King was in Northrend, so it was all kind of convenient. Dalaran also did have its logistical advantages as being a base to sort of wage war against the Lich King, so it definitely did make sense to help Kael'thas at the time. So basically, what happened to poor Lor'themar is he was strong-armed into committing troops into the Northrend campaign, and then allied with Kael'thas out of convenience. Romath and Haldraon were not very pleased, but there wasn't really much they could do about it. So then our initial attack on Northrend happened. We dealt with Naxxramas, we dealt with Ulduar, we dealt with the Nexus War, Sartharion, all these different things, and not much happened to do with Lor'themar until an ancient runeblade called Quel'Dalar was found. This sword was found and then reformed by the players, and at the very end of that questline we took it to the Sunwell. Now, the blade itself was actually wielded by a line of Blood Elves until it was finally wielded by Thalorian Dawnseeker, and Thalorian died in a fight against the Scourge. The blade was then recovered by Lanathel, who wanted to use it in the fight against the Scourge, but, however, just after her own death, she began to hate the sword. She defiled it, drained it of all of its power, and then discarded it at Quel'Dalar's Rest. In order to fully empower the blade, it had to be taken to the Sunwell. And when we take it there, if you're not a Blood Elf, Lor'themar will then thank you and try to claim the sword for their people, or really for himself, because he does personally just try to yank it off you. Instead, the sword rejects him, it blasts him back into the wall, and gives him a little bit of an ache, and after some tension, the player ends up claiming the sword, and Romath basically tells you to fuck off. Basically, I'll get very salty if a Blood Elf tries to take the sword. And then, of course, if the player is a Blood Elf, then Lor'themar will congratulate them and proclaim them as a hero of their people, which is probably fair enough. And once again, Lor'themar really does not do too much until the Cataclysm happens. Really, in that period between Wrath and Cataclysm, the kingdom was in very good shape. They just wanted to keep on working on rebuilding and, I guess, repopulating and doing all the sort of necessary things that a race would have to do after nearly being decimated. Another interesting thing that Lor'themar did in this time is that he allowed the Blood Elves to visit the Sunwell to end their dependency on magic. However, there were still quite a few refugees who would refuse to abandon their arcane addiction. But anyway, really, the Cataclysm happened, the world was all shaken up, and sure, Blood Elves ended up fighting in various places, but not much happened until patch 4.1, when the Amani Trolls returned. Lor'themar commanded Halduran and the Farsiders to go to battle immediately. Realizing that their forces were completely overstretched, he ended up getting the help of Vol'jin. Halduran then also, personally himself, got the aid of Risa Windrunner and her rangers. Lor'themar was not very pleased about an exile being brought into his lands without his permission. However, this was quickly brushed aside when Vol'jin started to plan a three-way attack against the Trolls. This whole attack against the Trolls was, of course, successful. Anyway, so after that, well, the Cataclysm ended. And during the Tides of War novel, shortly before the events of Mists of Panderia, there was a meeting with all the different Horde leaders. And during this meeting, Garrosh was basically scrutinized, mostly over the sheer amount of warmongering that he had done during the Cataclysm period. However, though, not really by Lor'themar. The two of them seem to have developed this kind of mutual respect. I guess for a character, Lor'themar does seem to be quite decisive, and perhaps Garrosh and him would sort of share that sort of element in common. Lor'themar also had a little bit of a run-in with Sylvanas at this time. Basically, all the leaders were planning this attack on Theramore. The attack was basically just to decimate the Alliance's strongest fortification on Kalimdor. But the thing is, right, since they are both on the Eastern Kingdoms, the Blood Elves and the Forsaken, they stood to be far more sort of susceptible to any kind of repercussions for this attack. Sylvanas was quite concerned about this, but Lor'themar really didn't care. Sylvanas really did get a little bit ticked off at him over that. Anyway, not a terrible deal came of it. Later on, he and Garrosh met in private, and this is when Lor'themar managed to squander all that good respect and that sort of thing, and get himself on Garrosh's watch list. When Garrosh reminded him that he basically was the Horde, Lor'themar corrected him, saying that he was merely the leader of the Horde. Garrosh was not pleased, and he added him to his very big evil list of people that he doesn't trust and need to be watched. And that would happen. Anyway, later on, Lor'themar and Sylvanas were supposed to directly aid this attack on Theramore, directly, but instead of actually turning up in person, they just sent 2 ships of warriors. This was probably also not really taken that well by Garrosh. Anyway, so this all happened around the time that Garrosh's mistrust for the Horde began to just grow and fester. Really, this is what would lead us into Mists of Panderia. Now, based on just the sheer amount of things that happen with Lor'themar in Mists, I'm going to leave that to the third part of the video. It probably won't be as long as this one, but damn, I mean, I just did not expect this guy to have so much lore when I set out to do this. I thought it would be one 8-minute video. It's probably going to end up being like a 35-minute 3-part series. So, hey, it was good fun. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please thumbs up and subscribe and all that good stuff, because it really does help me out. And with that, I will see you next time.